General Kitbuqa rode at the head of 20,000 Mongol warriors, the finest cavalry in the world, chasing what looked like a defeated Egyptian army fleeing across the Jezreel Valley. He'd spent 40 years conquering everything from China to Syria. The Mongols had destroyed Baghdad 2 years earlier, killed 1 million people, and erased the Islamic Golden Age. They'd never lost a major pitched battle in their entire history. In 3 hours, Kitbuqa would be dead, his army shattered, and the Mongol myth of invincibility broken forever. This is the story of how former slave soldiers used the Mongols' own signature tactic against them and saved Islamic civilization. And if you think the Mongols were unstoppable, wait until you hear about the battle where 100,000 Europeans faced 25,000 Mongols, and Europe's survival came down to 1 death in Mongolia. But that's next week's story. Today, September 3rd, 1260, the Unbeatable Army is about to learn what happens when your enemy has studied you for decades and knows exactly how you fight. The Mongol Empire in 1260 was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They'd conquered the Jin dynasty in China, destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, obliterated Russia, and crushed every army foolish enough to face them in the field. Their military system was perfect, every warrior trained from childhood, every tactic refined through generations of conquest, every battle won through superior mobility, archery, and coordination that European and Asian armies couldn't match. In 1258, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, had led Mongol forces to Baghdad. What happened there still haunts Islamic memory. The city that had been the intellectual center of the world was destroyed in 7 days. The Tigris River turned black with ink from destroyed books. 1 million people died. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled Islam for 5 centuries, ended with the caliph being trampled to death wrapped in a carpet. After Baghdad fell, Hulagu turned his army towards Syria. Aleppo fell in 6 days. Damascus surrendered without a fight. By 1260, Mongol forces stood at the edge of Egypt, and it seemed like nothing could stop them from conquering the entire Islamic world. But here's what most people don't know. Hulagu didn't stay to finish the job. In 1259, the great Khan Möngke died in China. Mongol law required all princes to return to Mongolia for the succession council. Hulagu took most of his army and rode east, leaving behind a skeleton force of maybe 20,000 troops under General Kitbuqa. This was the opening the Mamluks had been waiting for. The Mamluks were not typical medieval soldiers. They were former slaves taken as children from Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. Trained from youth to be warriors, the word Mamluk literally means owned. These men had been property, but they'd been trained by the best military system outside of Mongolia itself. They learned horsemanship, archery, sword fighting, and most importantly, they studied their enemies obsessively. Every Mamluk commander had intelligence reports on Mongol tactics. They knew how the Mongols fought. They knew the feigned retreat, the classic Mongol trick where they'd pretend to flee, draw enemies into pursuit, then turn and slaughter them. The Mamluks had studied this tactic for years. Now they were about to use it. Wait, it gets better. The Mamluks were led by a man named Baibars, and his story is legendary. He'd been born in Central Asia, sold into slavery as a child, trained as a warrior, and risen to become one of Egypt's greatest generals through pure skill and ruthlessness. Baibars was brilliant, brutal, and had spent his entire military career preparing to fight the Mongols. When Hulagu left with most of his army, Baibars convinced the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz to do something insane. Don't wait for the Mongols to invade Egypt. Attack them first. In July 1260, the Mamluk army marched out of Cairo, heading north into Palestine. This was bold to the point of suicidal. Conventional wisdom said you didn't attack the Mongols. You defended, you hid behind walls, you hoped they'd go away. Nobody attacked them in open field. But Baibars understood something crucial. The Mongol force in Syria was small, maybe 20,000 men. The Mamluk army numbered similar. For once, the numbers were even, and Baibars had a plan. Before we see how that plan worked, quick note. This is part of my Empire Killers series covering battles where smaller forces destroyed empires but schools never teach. New story every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The two armies met near a place called Ain Jalut, which means Spring of Goliath, in the Jezreel Valley in northern Palestine. The location was perfect for Baibars' trap. The valley was surrounded by hills with good cover. Mongol scouts spotted the Mamluk army and reported back to Kitbuqa. The Mongol general was confident. He'd been fighting for the Mongols since 1230, 30 years of conquest. He'd helped destroy the assassins at Alamut. He'd participated in the sack of Baghdad. He'd crushed Syrian resistance. He commanded the finest cavalry on earth. When he saw the Mamluk force, he saw another army about to be destroyed. What Kitbuqa didn't see were the thousands of Mamluk cavalry hidden in the hills on both sides of the valley. Baibars had positioned his troops the night before, concealed in perfect ambush positions. What the Mongols saw in the valley was just the bait, a smaller Mamluk force under Baibars himself, visible and seemingly vulnerable. September 3rd, 1260, dawn broke over Ain Jalut. The Mongol army formed up in their standard configuration, cavalry in the center, horse archers on the flanks, ready for the mobile warfare that had conquered half the world. The Mamluk center advanced to meet them. Arrows flew, the two forces clashed. For a few minutes it looked like a standard cavalry battle. Then Baibars gave the signal. The Mamluk center turned and fled. This is the moment. The feigned retreat. The signature Mongol tactic that had destroyed armies from Korea to Poland. Except this time, the Mongols weren't doing it. The Mamluks were. And Kitbuqa, seeing what looked like enemy panic and collapse, did exactly what Baibars hoped he'd do. He ordered pursuit. Remember, the Mongols had used this tactic successfully for decades. They'd seen it work hundreds of times, but they'd never been on the receiving end. Kitbuqa's cavalry charged after the retreating Mamluks, thinking they'd broken the Egyptian army in the opening minutes. The Mongol force pushed deeper into the valley, chasing victory. They rode right into the trap. Here's the part everyone misses. The retreating Mamluks weren't running blindly. They were leading the Mongols to a killing zone. Baibars had calculated the distances perfectly. The Mamluks retreated just fast enough to keep the Mongols chasing, just slow enough to keep them engaged. They drew Kitbuqa's army into the center of the valley, surrounded by hills on both sides. And then the trap sprung. Thousands of Mamluk cavalry emerged from the hills, pouring down on both flanks of the Mongol army. The Mongols suddenly found themselves surrounded. The cavalry they'd been chasing turned around and charged back. The forces that had been hidden in the hills crashed into their flanks. The Mongols were caught in a three-sided vice with no room to maneuver. This is where everything changes. The Mongols' greatest strength was mobility. They won battles by moving faster than enemies, shooting from horseback, refusing to get trapped in close combat. But at Ain Jalut, they were pinned. The valley that had looked perfect for cavalry warfare became a cage. Mongol warriors tried to form defensive positions, but Mamluk cavalry kept the pressure on from all sides. Mongol horse archers shot back, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. The battle degenerated into brutal close-quarters fighting. This was exactly what Baibars wanted. Mamluk warriors were trained for melee combat, skilled with swords and lances. The Mongols preferred ranged combat and maneuver. Forced into a stationary slugging match, their advantages evaporated. The fighting lasted for hours. It was desperate, chaotic, vicious. Mongol warriors fought with the courage that had built their empire, but courage wasn't enough. They were surrounded, outnumbered by the forces emerging from the hills, and trapped in terrain that neutralized their mobility. Kitbuqa himself led charges trying to break through the Mamluk encirclement. He was 60 years old, a lifetime warrior, and he refused to retreat. According to sources, he fought in the front ranks alongside his men, trying through personal leadership to rally his forces. It didn't work. The Mamluk vice kept closing. Mongol casualties mounted. The army that had seemed invincible was being systematically destroyed. Kitbuqa died in the valley that afternoon. Some sources say he was killed by Baibars personally. Others say he was overwhelmed by multiple Mamluk warriors. Either way, once the Mongol commander fell, resistance collapsed. The Mongol army broke. Survivors tried to flee, but the Mamluks pursued them ruthlessly. It wasn't just a defeat. It was annihilation. Of the 20,000 or so Mongol troops who entered the Jezreel Valley that morning, only a handful escaped. The rest died at Ain Jalut, or in the pursuit afterward. The Mamluks had done what seemed impossible. They'd destroyed a Mongol army in pitched battle. They'd used the Mongols' own tactics against them. The feigned retreat, signature move that had destroyed so many armies, had just killed a Mongol general and shattered his force. The myth of Mongol invincibility died with Kitbuqa in that valley. But here's what nobody tells you about what happened next. The real significance of Ain Jalut wasn't just that battle. It was what the Mamluk victory prevented. If the Mongols had won, if Kitbuqa had destroyed the Mamluk army, Egypt would have been defenseless. The Mongols would have conquered North Africa. The entire Islamic world from the Atlantic to the Pacific would have been under Mongol control. Islamic civilization as an independent force would have ended. Instead, the Mamluks won, and Islamic civilization survived. The strategic consequences were immediate and permanent. When news of Ain Jalut reached the Mongol princes in the east, they faced a choice: send another massive army west to avenge Kitbuqa, or focus on internal politics and the Chinese front. They chose internal politics. The Mongol westward expansion stopped at Syria. They never tried to conquer Egypt again. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that ruled Persia, fought border wars with the Mamluks for decades, but never again attempted full conquest. The high tide of Mongol expansion had reached its limit, and that limit was set at Ain Jalut. For Baibars, victory brought power. Within weeks of Ain Jalut, he murdered Sultan Qutuz and seized the throne himself. This was Mamluk politics, brutal, pragmatic, meritocratic. Baibars ruled Egypt for 17 years, fought the Crusaders, expanded Mamluk power, and became one of the greatest Muslim rulers of the medieval period. He's still a legend in Egypt and the Arab world, the slave who became sultan and defeated the Mongols. The military lessons of Ain Jalut spread rapidly. Word reached Europe that the Mongols could be beaten. It reached China, where enemies of Mongol rule took hope. It reached Central Asia, where resistance movements gained confidence. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical victory. For decades, fighting the Mongols had seemed hopeless. They won every time. Armies that faced them were destroyed. Cities that resisted them were obliterated. After Ain Jalut, that changed. The Mongols were still dangerous, still militarily powerful, but they weren't inevitable anymore. Here's the tactical breakdown that military historians still study. The Mamluks won because they understood their enemy perfectly. They knew Mongol tactics, they knew the feigned retreat, they knew Mongol commanders were aggressive and would pursue broken enemies. Baibars used that knowledge to create a tactical situation where Mongol strengths became weaknesses. He traded mobility for position, used terrain to limit Mongol maneuver, and forced close combat where Mamluk training gave them advantage. It was a masterclass in tactical adaptation. Compare this to how other armies fought the Mongols. European forces at Mohi tried to hold defensive positions and were outmaneuvered. Chinese armies tried to match Mongol mobility and were outmatched. Russian princes fought individually and were destroyed separately. The Mamluks succeeded because they didn't try to beat the Mongols at their own game. They changed the game entirely. They used Mongol tactics against Mongols, fought in terrain that limited Mongol advantages, and maintained discipline when it would have been easy to panic. The question historians still debate is whether Ain Jalut was inevitable or contingent. If Hulagu had stayed with his full army instead of returning to Mongolia, could the Mamluks have won? Probably not. The Mamluk army was formidable, but Hulagu commanded maybe 100,000 troops. Against those numbers, tactical brilliance wouldn't have been enough. The Mamluks won because the Great Khan's death created a window where Mongol forces were temporarily weak. Baibars was smart enough to recognize that window and bold enough to attack through it. Victory required both opportunity and the courage to seize it. The long-term consequences extended beyond military defeat. After Ain Jalut, the Mongol Empire began fragmenting into competing khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. All theoretically acknowledged the Great Khan's authority, but increasingly acted independently. The unified Mongol Empire that had terrorized Eurasia was splitting apart. Ain Jalut didn't cause that split, but it accelerated it by showing that Mongol expansion had limits and that different khanates would pursue different priorities. For the Crusaders still clinging to coastal footholds in Palestine, Ain Jalut was bad news. They'd hoped Mongol conquest of the Islamic world might help Christianity. Some Crusader states had even allied with the Mongols against Muslims. After Ain Jalut, those hopes collapsed. The Mamluks, victorious and confident, turned their attention to the Crusader kingdoms. Baibars spent the next decade systematically destroying Crusader fortresses. Antioch fell in 1268. The Crac des Chevaliers, greatest Crusader castle, fell in 1271. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land, which had lasted nearly 200 years, ended in 1291 when the Mamluks took Acre. Ain Jalut didn't just save Islamic civilization, it doomed the Crusades. The Mamluk state that emerged from Ain Jalut dominated the Middle East for 250 years. They controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They patronized scholars and artists. Cairo became the Islamic world's intellectual center, replacing destroyed Baghdad. The Mamluk military system, based on slave soldiers trained from childhood, proved remarkably stable and effective. They fought off Crusaders, resisted Mongols, and maintained independence while other Islamic states fell. The system only ended when the Ottomans conquered Egypt in 1517, bringing artillery and gunpowder tactics that the Mamluk cavalry couldn't match. The cultural memory of Ain Jalut remains powerful in the Islamic world, especially in Egypt. It's taught as the moment when Muslim armies stopped Mongol aggression and saved Islamic civilization. Streets and schools are named after Baibars. The battle is commemorated in poetry, literature, and national mythology. For Arabs especially, Ain Jalut represents successful resistance against overwhelming force, a David versus Goliath story where the underdog won through intelligence and courage. Here's the part that makes Ain Jalut unique in military history. This was the first time anyone beat the Mongols at their own game using their own tactics. The Russians tried to fight the Mongols in the 1220s and were destroyed. The Poles and Hungarians tried in 1241 and were annihilated. The Chinese fought for decades before finally submitting. But the Mamluks studied Mongol methods, adapted them, and turned them against their creators. The feigned retreat that had destroyed so many armies destroyed a Mongol army at Ain Jalut. It's like teaching someone chess, then having them beat you using a strategy you invented. That's what Baibars did to Kitbuqa. The actual battlefield at Ain Jalut is in the Jezreel Valley near modern-day Afula in Israel. You can visit it today, though there's not much to see. It's farmland now, peaceful and quiet. Standing there, it's hard to imagine 40,000 cavalry crashing together, arrows filling the air, men dying in the valley where they'd expected victory. But that's where it happened. That's where the Mongol advance stopped. That's where a former slave named Baibars proved that even empires that seem invincible have limits. The lesson of Ain Jalut is simple but profound. Study your enemy. Understand how they think. Know their tactics better than they know them themselves. Then use that knowledge to create situations where their strengths become weaknesses. The Mongols were masters of mobile warfare and the feigned retreat. Baibars used mobile warfare and a feigned retreat to destroy them. He didn't try to be different. He became a better version of what they already were. September the 3rd, 1260 changed history. The Mongol army that rode into the Jezreel Valley expecting another easy victory was destroyed by the afternoon. Kitbuqa died in the valley. His soldiers died with him or fled east, carrying news of impossible defeat. The Mongols never tried to conquer Egypt again. The westward expansion that had started with Genghis Khan in 1206 ended 54 years later at Ain Jalut. Not because the Mongols became weak, but because they finally faced an enemy who had studied them long enough to beat them. Next week, we're covering the Battle of Mohi, where 100,000 European soldiers faced 25,000 Mongols, and Europe came within one death of complete conquest. This is Empire Killers, where I cover the battles that stopped invasions and ended empires, but nobody remembers. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop a comment below. Which battle should I cover after Mohi? What story needs to be told? The Mamluks proved something at Ain Jalut that the world needed to learn. Even the unbeatable can be beaten if you're smart enough, brave enough, and prepared enough. Kitbuqa rode into that valley thinking he commanded destiny. He died learning that destiny belongs to whoever plans better. That's the lesson of Ain Jalut. That's why it matters. That's why, 764 years later, we're still talking about the day slave soldiers broke the Mongol army and saved a civilization.